On the evening of March 27, 1937, a 20-year-old woman named Veronica Ronnie Gideon walked alone down a dark street in New York City. She hugged herself against the early spring chill as she made her way to the home of a man she barely knew. Ronnie's boyfriend had left for the Easter weekend to visit his family, so he had asked his best friend to keep an eye on Ronnie while he was away. That friend had invited Ronnie to his place for dinner and then an evening of drinking and dancing. And that's where Ronnie was headed right now. She was feeling a bit nervous, but also excited, and she was wearing one of her favorite outfits, a pretty blue tea dress. Ronnie thought it was pretty funny that her boyfriend was so worried she might cheat on him that he had basically set her up on a date tonight himself. Sure, a second man was going to join Ronnie and her boyfriend's best friend, but that just meant Ronnie would be out on the town with two men that were not her boyfriend. And they planned to stay out at the bars until they closed at 3 a.m. But even if she didn't admit this, Ronnie did understand why she made her boyfriend nervous. She was totally gorgeous, with a bubbly personality and a quick sense of humor. She also had a modeling career that was really starting to get her noticed, too. In fact, recently, she'd started to think she could actually become a famous model. Only a few days earlier, the latest issue of Inside Detective magazine had hit newsstands all over the city, and there on the cover was Ronnie herself. In the photo, she looked terrified, with one arm shielding her face and the other covering her bare chest. The picture was supposed to illustrate an alarming story called Party Girl, about unmarried young women who like to drink and have premarital sex until they all get sent to jail for immorality. In the 1930s, true crime magazines that featured barely dressed young women in danger were enormously popular, and Ronnie had appeared on several covers with headlines like "Pretty but Cheap" and "I Am a White Slave." But the real Ronnie was nothing like those pictures. She liked to go out and have a good time, but she wasn't wild. She had only been in love one time, when she was 16 years old and she eloped with a family friend named Bobby Flower, but that marriage ended disastrously after only a few weeks. And for many nights after that breakup, Ronnie felt heartbroken about losing Bobby, and she'd write about him in her diary until she fell asleep. And now, 4 years later, despite having a new boyfriend, Ronnie wasn't actually looking for love. She was just looking to have fun. And what better place than New York City, Ronnie thought as she stepped off the curb to cross Fifth Avenue. And at that moment, a yellow taxicab zipped by close enough to make Ronnie jump back and jolt her out of her daydream. And then, after collecting herself, she looked up and she could see she was just a few blocks away from Steve's place near Central Park. Steve's neighborhood was way more fashionable than Ronnie's. Ronnie still lived at home with her mother, Mary Gideon, in a tiny fourth-floor apartment near the East River. Ronnie found her home to be pretty depressing. Her mother had been unhappily married to her father, Joseph Gideon, for decades, until her father had left the family 3 years earlier. Joseph was a sour man who repaired furniture for a living, and he did not approve of Ronnie's love of the nightlife. Ronnie had been relieved when he moved out, though he still had a key and came over on holidays and on some weekends. But even without Ronnie's dad around, the apartment was still overcrowded. This was the Great Depression, and people often rented extra rooms to strangers to raise extra money. One of Mary and Ronnie's roommates was a boarder named Frank Burns, who lived in one of the bedrooms and joined the family at dinner each night, and the other boarder was one of Ronnie's friends, who was just staying temporarily. So lately, Ronnie had been sharing the same bed as her mother. Ronnie loved her mother, but she sometimes felt like the walls were closing in when they would spend the evening together listening to the radio in their tiny living room. It was even harder when Frank joined them. He was partially deaf, and her mother had to turn the radio up super loud just so he could hear his favorite show, Amos and Andy. And Frank was just one in a parade of boarders who intruded on Ronnie's family life. Ronnie recalled one other boarder, a struggling artist named Bob Irwin, who wanted to marry her big sister, Ethel. Her sister was a very beautiful woman, but who hid her beauty behind horn-rimmed glasses and hair that was pulled into a tight bun. She said she was not interested in Bob, but Bob never gave up. He continued to drop in on the family even after he had moved out. In short, the apartment had long felt like a prison to Ronnie. By comparison, she felt absolutely free when she went out to the bars and clubs of New York. Just then, Ronnie passed by the famous Radio City Music Hall where she had seen the movie Snow White with her boyfriend, Lincoln Hauser, a couple of months earlier. And they had had so much fun, Ronnie remembered, and the colors were totally amazing. Lincoln liked to tell people that the two of them were engaged, which was not actually true, but they were a pretty good couple. And thinking about this made Ronnie feel kind of strange that she was now about to go have dinner and drinks with Lincoln's best friend. Ronnie approached the front door of her boyfriend's friend, Stephen Butter, a little before 8 p.m. As she climbed the front steps, she could hear big band swing music blaring from Stephen's radio. She rang the bell. Moments later, Stephen, who was dressed in a sharp pinstripe suit complete with a pocket handkerchief, opened the door and welcomed Ronnie inside with a theatrical bow. This was going to be a fun night. For the next 6 hours, Ronnie lost herself in the evening with Stephen and his other friend. They had planned to go bar hopping, but they were having such a good time dancing to the radio music while drinking gin and beer that they just stayed at Stephen's place until quite late. Stephen expected Ronnie to make them dinner, but she wasn't offended. The kitchen was considered women's work in those days, so Ronnie made a pasta dinner for all three of them. Stephen was not quite as handsome as Ronnie's boyfriend, and his family was not quite as wealthy. But Ronnie thought he was still very charming and had lots of promise. He was working on Wall Street after all, and the more gin and beer they drank, the more they flirted and danced cheek to cheek. Finally, at 2 a.m., Stephen's other friend called it a night and went home, but Steve and Ronnie decided their night was not quite done. They threw on their coats and they headed for the Monte Carlo Bar and Grill, which was on the way to Ronnie's apartment, for a few more gin highballs. As Ronnie swallowed her last sip of alcohol, she thought about how her night might have turned out if she'd listened to her mother. Mary had wanted Ronnie home to help in the kitchen. Tomorrow was Easter Sunday, and they were expecting guests, Ronnie's sister Ethel and her husband, as well as their father. But Ronnie had secretly slipped out the door for the evening while her mother was still out shopping for the pork loin and green beans. Ronnie felt guilty, but not too much. By the time Steve escorted Ronnie back to her apartment building, they were leaning on each other to keep from falling down. But they both knew that since Ronnie was dating Steve's best friend, they shouldn't let things get romantic. So instead of a goodnight kiss, Steve offered to escort Ronnie to church the next morning for Easter Mass at 10, and she happily said yes. Ronnie let herself in the main building door and began climbing the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment. She was a little dizzy from all the booze, but she felt lighthearted. Steve had been a good companion for the evening, and she was glad that she'd see him again in the morning. Ronnie walked in the door of her apartment at about 3 a.m., trying to be extra quiet so she didn't wake up the people inside, which included her mother and one of the 2 boarders named Frank. As for the other boarder, which was Ronnie's friend, they were out of town. Ronnie quietly ducked into the bathroom near the front door and undressed down to her slip. She took off her makeup and washed her face and hands. She brushed her teeth and then brushed her hair. And then finally, she was ready for bed, and so she tiptoed to the dark, silent bedroom where she and her mother slept. As she entered the bedroom, Ronnie couldn't see or hear a thing, not even her mother's breathing. And then suddenly, a hard object struck Ronnie in the face. It stunned Ronnie far more than it hurt her, but she was so terrified and confused, she didn't move an inch. And then a second later, a man's hand came out of the blackness and squeezed around Ronnie's throat and then shoved her roughly onto the bed. "Please don't touch me," Ronnie managed to croak in little more than a whisper, but the man just squeezed tighter. The next morning was Easter, and Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon, woke up feeling totally hungover inside of the little room he had been renting since he separated from Ronnie's mother, Mary. But despite Joseph's throbbing headache from all the beers and shots of alcohol he had drank the night before, Joseph was actually in a great mood. He was going to have dinner with his family, and he and his estranged wife, Mary, had big news. After 3 years of separation, they were actually going to give married life another try. Joseph could not wait to tell his 2 daughters. Joseph slapped on his fedora hat and whistled as he walked the few blocks from his rented room to his wife's apartment, arriving a full half an hour before his 2:30 p.m. invitation. Not wanting to be rude by showing up early, Joseph found a payphone and called Mary, but no one answered. But Joseph didn't mind. He figured they must still be out at the Easter parade, and so in the meantime, he went shopping for gifts for his family, which included buying cigars that he planned to smoke with his daughter Ethel's husband to celebrate his reunion with his ex-wife Mary. But when Joseph returned back to Mary's apartment building and rang the front entrance door to the lobby at about 2:40 p.m., there was still no answer inside, and Joseph suddenly wondered if he had gotten the time wrong. Joseph was still standing right outside the main door of this building when his daughter Ethel and her husband came up behind him. Ethel told Joseph that he was right, the dinner was scheduled for 2:30 p.m., but she thought, maybe Mom might have the radio up too loud, and so she can't hear the buzzing of the bell when you ring it. And so Joseph nodded and tried the bell a couple more times, but still nobody opened up the front door. Eventually, another tenant inside the building heard all this buzzing and just let all three of them in the main door to the building. Joseph immediately bounded up the 4 flights of stairs to Mary and Ronnie's apartment. He was going to give them a piece of his mind for leaving the Easter guests waiting outside. But when he got to the actual apartment door, leaving Ethel and her husband far behind, Joseph immediately knew something just wasn't right. The front door was not fully shut, it had not latched, and so when Joseph pushed on it just lightly, it flung open. And when he stepped into the living room, he saw Ronnie's little Pekingese dog named Tucci. Usually, Tucci would run right up to him, but today, Tucci stayed put and just sat there very reserved, with her ears flat against her head. Joseph called out for Mary and Ronnie, but there was only silence in the apartment. Joseph looked across to the kitchen and saw the pork, which was supposed to be today's dinner, sitting on the counter, obviously uncooked. Joseph went into the bedroom that Mary and Ronnie shared, but no one was there. Nothing was disturbed, except there were broken pieces of a bar of soap scattered all across the carpet. With mounting anxiety, Joseph then entered the second bedroom where Ronnie used to sleep until her friend moved in, and what he saw in there was worse than anything Joseph could have imagined. His daughter, Ronnie, was lying stark naked on the bed, her eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. Her skin was the color gray-blue, and her neck was mottled with dark bruises. Joseph practically fell over in his haste to get out of the room containing his daughter's corpse. But when he stumbled into the third bedroom, there was only more horror. Frank, the boarder, was lying under the covers, the blanket right up to his neck, but his head was mutilated and covered in blood. Joseph could not take it anymore, and he just ran out of the apartment and began charging down the stairs while screaming, "They're all dead!" He breathlessly told Ethel and her husband about the terrible things he had just seen, and they both instantly went pale. But then Ethel asked, "Well, what about Mother?" Joseph said he had not seen her, and he just hoped she had escaped and ran to the police. And then Joseph did exactly that. He ran out of the apartment and then ran a block away to the neighborhood police station, where he reported what he had just found. Minutes later, Joseph returned to the apartment, now with a detective by his side. And almost immediately, the detective made another shocking discovery. He saw a foot sticking out from under the bed that Ronnie was lying on top of. Peering underneath, the detective could see there was another body. It was Mary Gideon, and she was fully dressed and had terrible bruising around her neck. Whoever had killed her had apparently tried to hide her body by wedging it beneath the bed. All 3 victims' bodies were very stiff by the time they were found. They had clearly all been dead for hours. By late Sunday afternoon, a small army of New York detectives, led by tough guy Assistant Chief Inspector John A. Lyons, had descended on Ronnie and Mary's apartment, and the flashbulbs of crime scene photographers popped in every room as they recorded details of the gruesome murders. The detectives found a single gray suede glove in Frank's bedroom, likely left behind by the killer. They also found Ronnie's torn silk panties behind the headboard where her body lay, suggesting it was her assailant who had removed her clothes, either before or after killing her. Aside from the corpses, though, the apartment seemed totally undisturbed. This was not a robbery. The killer came specifically for these people. Inspector Lyons concluded that the boarder, Frank, one of the victims, was probably killed first as he slept. Someone had stabbed him 11 times in the head, likely with an ice pick. His skull was nearly caved in. Both Ronnie and Mary had been strangled to death by someone's hands, and Mary, at least, had put up a fierce fight. She had bruises all over her knuckles. The detectives could not say for sure if the women had been sexually assaulted, but it seemed fairly obvious to Inspector Lyons that they must have. However, he would leave it to the medical examiner to confirm that detail. One other thing stood out to Inspector Lyons as he puffed on a cigar and watched another detective give Ronnie's dog a belly scratch. Why didn't the neighbors hear anything whilst 3 brutal murders were committed in the middle of the night? Tucci was the type of nervous little dog that barked incessantly at strangers, but apparently Tucci had not made a sound at all, or had just been so quiet that neighbors were not woken up by the dog. But to Lyons, the implication here was clear. Whoever committed what would soon be known as the Easter Sunday Massacre must have known this dog well, so much so that the dog did not bark when they saw this person. The next day, the murders made the papers. In New York, there were newspapers that warned of a, quote, sex fiend that was on the loose in the city and that he would surely strike again. The media really fixated on the fact that Ronnie was this beautiful model who was found in the nude, and so they eagerly printed these photographs from Ronnie's modeling work where she was in various states of undress. By coincidence, Ronnie had been murdered exactly 1 year after another sensational murder just down the street. A delivery man had snuck into the apartment of writer Nancy Titterton and then assaulted her, strangled her, and left her tied up naked in her bathtub. Now, the Titterton murder seemed to be happening all over again, the newspaper said. One newspaper said that all American women were now in danger from the rising wave of sex murders. Locksmiths reported a sudden increase in lock sales to men eager to protect their women from predators. Inspector Lyons felt his blood pressure starting to rise as he read the morning headlines while he finished his breakfast. A story about the murder described Ronnie as being this prize beauty who was slaughtered by a sex-crazed lunatic who was still on the loose. To Lyons, stories like these just made his job harder, whipping up public fears and putting pressure on the police to find the killer faster, which he felt just encouraged sloppy detective work. Just then, as if on cue, the police commissioner himself called Lyons. And he told him to take as many detectives as he needed because solving the Easter Sunday Massacre was now the department's top goal. By the time Lyons set off for police headquarters that morning, he had a plan to employ 75 detectives who would talk to everyone who lived near the Gideons, and they would talk to anyone who knew the Gideons over the past few years. This would be one of the biggest criminal investigations in New York City's history. And Lyons would make it clear to his massive team of investigators that they should not hesitate to get rough with people if they had to. One of the first people brought in for questioning was Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon. At 4 p.m. that Monday, Joseph Gideon reported to the same neighborhood police station where he came running to plead for help the day before. This time, though, he was trailed by a gang of reporters who were shouting questions at him while he remained grimly silent. Joseph expected to be treated as a grieving loved one, but the police treated him like a suspect from the start. They fingerprinted him and made him empty all his pockets to be sure he had no weapons. Then they relentlessly grilled him with questions for 12 hours as detectives took turns trying to get Joseph to break down. But over the course of this interview, Joseph only grew more ornery. Joseph had an alibi. Well, sort of. He had spent Saturday evening drinking at a bar and playing skee-ball with some other people who could confirm he was there. But by the time his daughter and his ex-wife were killed sometime after 3 a.m., Joseph was sleeping off the bender in his bed with no witnesses. One detective called Joseph a liar for saying he had nothing to do with the heinous crime, so Joseph called the detective a liar right back. Police eventually had to let Joseph go at about 4 a.m. on Tuesday because they had absolutely no evidence that he had done anything wrong, but they weren't quite done with Joseph. When Joseph went to his furniture repair shop to open up for the day a few hours later, he found 5 detectives waiting for him. They immediately seized the long needles that Joseph used for working on upholstery to see if maybe they matched the wounds on Frank Burns' head. Now, Joseph complained very bitterly to police. He couldn't even do his job. Reporters who had been tailing Joseph saw him blow up at the police, and they immediately crowded around the little upholsterer. And this time, Joseph shocked them by saying really horrible things about his dead wife and daughter. He said that his daughter, Ronnie, was wild and willful and that she loved to tease men. Maybe one of them had finally killed her for it, he said. When one of the reporters suggested that the killer could be someone romantically involved with his wife, he scoffed. He said that his wife was so cold that men, aside from him, probably would not find her attractive. As Joseph was talking to these reporters, he showed no sign that he was actually grieving the loss of his family. Instead, he just seemed really, really mad. And so after a wave of newspaper stories printed Joseph's harsh comments, Lyons' investigators began focusing even harder on Joseph. He certainly seemed unfeeling enough to potentially have killed his own family. Now, the detectives were obviously very suspicious of Joseph Gideon, but that didn't mean anything he said to them they didn't take seriously. And so when Joseph suggested police should really look into all the men in his daughter's life to see if maybe they had something to do with it, the police said, yeah, we will do that. And so the police tracked down all the men who had dated Ronnie over the years, or Ronnie had been close to in some way, starting with Stephen Butter, the man that Ronnie had been with the evening right before she had died, the best friend of her boyfriend. Stephen had gone to pick up Ronnie for Easter Mass, as they had planned to, on Sunday morning. But when he got there, just before 10 a.m., no one answered the buzzer. And so Stephen went back home, perplexed, and he kept calling Ronnie periodically throughout the day until 3 p.m. when a detective answered the phone. The detective told Stephen they needed to talk to him right away, but didn't say why. By the time Stephen got to the police station an hour later, he was so nervous he was visibly shaking. But when police began speaking to him, he didn't really add much of value. Stephen didn't even know Ronnie was dead until he got to the police station. All Stephen could say was that Ronnie was a, quote, swell kid, and they had a, quote, swell time together. Lyons pretty much immediately dismissed Stephen as a suspect, but Ronnie's social life left investigators with plenty more men to talk to, and Ronnie had some seriously complicated relationships with men. When Ronnie's boyfriend, Lincoln Hauser, spoke to detectives at his home, he alternated between praise for Ronnie as a sweet church-going young woman and slammed her as a party girl who often stayed out all night and loved to, quote, play the field with other men. Lincoln admitted that he worried his girlfriend would cheat on him when he was away, but he trusted his friend Stephen to keep an eye on her for him, which is why he had set them up to hang out that night. But Lincoln would say, despite the quarrels they had in their relationship, he loved Ronnie and was absolutely devastated by her death. Also, Lincoln had a solid alibi. He was 50 miles away with family when Ronnie was killed. Ronnie's ex-husband, Bobby, came to the police station next for questioning, and he insisted he had no hard feelings after his marriage to Ronnie broke up. He said they were both too young to be married, and they stayed friends and even got together once in a while. He had last seen Ronnie a few weeks before her death when they went to a movie. At some point, Bobby would tell Detective Lyons that he really hoped they would find the murderer and send him to the electric chair. So far, Ronnie's love life had not produced much in the way of a suspect. Of all her partners, Bobby was probably Lyons' best bet, given the failed marriage, but both Bobby and Ronnie seemed to have genuinely moved on from each other. Then, one of Ronnie's closest friends suggested that police take a look at a sometime chauffeur named George Frenchy Guéret, who previously rented a room in Mary and Ronnie's apartment. He was an eccentric man who wore his chauffeur's uniform even when he wasn't working, and he spoke in a heavy French accent. But behind his kind of goofy, harmless exterior, Frenchy had a criminal record. Most importantly, according to Ronnie's friend, He had fought with Ronnie's mother, Mary, over money. In addition, Frenchie had developed a crush on Ronnie, but she had no interest, and she told him to leave her alone. Two of Lyons' detectives visited Frenchie at his rented room a few blocks from Ronnie's apartment. There, they would find 2 bloody handkerchiefs, which Frenchie blamed on nosebleeds. Frenchie did have an alibi, saying he had spent Easter weekend at a buddy's apartment, but when the detectives visited that apartment, they found no less than 4 ice picks, including one that appeared to be blood-stained. By Monday afternoon, the late editions of the newspapers were speculating that Frenchie had committed these murders, perhaps with the help of the friend he stayed with that weekend. Police quickly arrested both men. But a police analyst determined that the stain on the ice pick seized by police was not blood, it was rust. And they had no other evidence to connect Frenchie and his friend to the murders, and so Lyons reluctantly let them go. At a crowded press conference on Tuesday, 3 days after the murders, Lyons showed serious frustration from the 3 days of nonstop investigating with little to show for it. He admitted that detectives were, quote, in the dark about who killed Mary, Ronnie, and Frank. There was one very small bit of good news, though. The coroner reported that there was no physical evidence that either woman was sexually assaulted. Maybe the killer was not a sex fiend after all. And so the detectives decided to redouble their efforts on looking into Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon. Everywhere Joseph went in those first days after the murders, he was followed by reporters, giving him endless chances to say something to make his position worse. He knew that he was under police scrutiny, but he boasted to reporters that the police could not break him, and he flew into a rage when reporters questioned his whereabouts at the time of the killings. Adding to public suspicions, the walls of Joseph's shop were covered with French postcards featuring naked women, and he admitted to a fondness for erotica. One newspaper said that Joseph suffered from, quote, queer animal desires that prompted him to leave his wife. Maybe, the newspaper speculated, Joseph was driven by some perversion to kill his own family. On Thursday, April 1st, so 4 days after the murders, detectives returned to Joseph's shop to look for a long needle that they had missed on their first sweep. They had already confiscated most of Joseph's tools, but a sharp-eyed upholsterer who did not know Joseph, who just happened to see a picture in the newspaper of all of Joseph's equipment that had been confiscated, told police that it looked like one needle was missing. He said it was a foot-long, quote, regulator with a very sharp point that every good furniture restorer would have. And police knew this tool was plenty big enough to have been the weapon that killed Frank Byrne. Newspapers immediately started running with the story, referring to the missing needle as the Gideon death needle, but the detectives would never find it. However, in their search for this other needle, they would find something else very unexpected in Joseph's shop, an unlicensed, loaded .38 caliber revolver hidden in a corner. Since Joseph had previously told police that he did not have a gun, they had now caught him in a lie. When one of the detectives phoned Assistant Chief Inspector Lyons with this news, he was elated. Now, Lyons said, they had Joseph Gideon right where they wanted him. Lyons ordered his men to start trailing Joseph wherever he went, just like the reporters were doing. They were going to allow Joseph to attend the funeral for his wife and his daughter, but that didn't mean he'd be going alone. Lyons told them to give Joseph a police escort so that a law enforcement officer was never more than an arm's length away. Several thousand people were waiting outside McCabe's funeral parlor when the police car carrying Joseph Gideon pulled up on Thursday afternoon. People were out on the sidewalk, while many more were draped over fire escapes, looking out windows, and even standing on the roof. Many hoped for a glimpse of the man suspected of killing Ronnie and Mary, and when Joseph stepped out of the police car, surrounded by 4 detectives, someone in the crowd shouted, "There he is!" But before anyone could lay a hand on Joseph, the detectives hustled him through the mob and into the chapel. There, Mary and Ronnie lay side by side in open caskets, surrounded by flowers, many from Ronnie's male admirers, as well as artists that she had worked with. The chapel was absolutely full, but only a handful of people actually knew the victims personally. People such as her ex-husband Bobby Flower, her boyfriend Lincoln Hauser, and her boyfriend's best friend Stephen Butter, the last person to see Ronnie alive, aside from her killer. And there were a few people who had known the Gideons from the past, people like Bob Irwin, the young sculptor who had once boarded with Ronnie and Mary and asked Ronnie's older sister Ethel to marry him. Bob dabbed a tear from his eye with a handkerchief as the priest stepped up to the pulpit and began to speak. After the service was over, several of the men who had loved Ronnie kissed her as they passed her casket and openly wept. As for Ronnie's father, Joseph, he would keep his composure inside of the chapel, but when they all made their way out to the cemetery, he would break down in heavy sobs as he watched his daughter and ex-wife lowered into the ground. As he wept, his other daughter, Ethel, ran over and gave him a hug and cried with him. After the burial was over, police did not wait. They immediately grabbed Joseph and took him directly to the police station, where they would question him for another 6 straight hours, shaking and occasionally slapping Joseph the whole time. Despite Joseph's emotional display at the cemetery, detectives still strongly suspected he had killed his own family members, and if they pressed hard enough, he would confess. But without that missing needle that apparently Joseph could have used to kill the boarder Frank, or some other physical evidence linking Joseph to the crime in some way, prosecutors were not able to charge Joseph with murder. And when Joseph continued to deny that he was the killer, the police went to their plan B, and they charged him with illegal gun possession and put him in jail for that. By early Friday morning, April 2nd, less than a week after the murders, jail guards were taking Joseph's belt, necktie, and shoelaces to prevent him from committing suicide. Then they led him to his cell. Joseph's mind was numb as he sat on his jail cell cot, staring up at the bare light bulb that lit up the cell. The police had been questioning him relentlessly since he found the bodies of his wife and daughter 4 days earlier, and when detectives weren't grilling him, reporters followed his every move and shouted more questions. He had slept no more than maybe a few hours the whole time. For just a second, Joseph recalled last Sunday morning when he had been so excited to tell his daughters that he was getting back together with their mother. And now that was all gone. Then Joseph Gideon fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Assistant Chief Inspector Lyons was amazed at Joseph Gideon's stubbornness. He was the leading suspect in a triple murder, but Joseph refused to give an inch, even when police questioned him for hours and tried to scare the man with threats, shoves, or slaps across his face. Lyons was hopeful that Joseph would crack after a few days in jail, but he knew that his team could not put all their hopes in just one suspect. After all, the case they had against Joseph was far from airtight. And one of Lyons' best detectives had found what looked like a pretty good piece of evidence pointing toward a different suspect, one that made it look like Ronnie's ex-husband, Bobby Flower, was not who he appeared to be. The evidence found was Ronnie's diary. The entries from 4 years earlier in 1933, when she married Bobby Flower, oozed with love for him. She would do anything for Bobby. He was her soulmate. This tracked with what Bobby had told police. But in 1934, Ronnie's diary entries took a dark turn. She started writing about how Bobby seemed to be stalking her sister Ethel. Bobby was out of his head, she wrote, and she was afraid of him. The discovery suggested that Bobby Flower lied to the police about having, quote, no hard feelings for Ronnie. Now, Bobby looked like an obsessed and potentially dangerous liar. So, Detective Lyons went straight to Ronnie's sister Ethel. He figured she would be the best person to fill him in on the details of Bobby Flower's troubling past. When the detective arrived at Ethel's home in Queens, she greeted him cordially, but as Lyons started explaining that he wanted to hear more about how Bobby Flower stalked her, he watched as Ethel's face grew more and more puzzled. Finally, Ethel interrupted Lyons and just asked him, "What are you talking about?" And now it was Lyons' turn to be confused. He pulled out Ronnie's diary and began walking Ethel through some of the entries. At first, Ethel just stared at the little book uncomprehendingly. But when Lyons started reading her the passages about how Ronnie was afraid of Bobby and how Bobby wouldn't leave the family alone, a light suddenly clicked on inside of Ethel's brain. She put her hand on Lyons' arm to silence him, and with big, serious eyes, she said she knew exactly what Ronnie was talking about. Inspector Lyons walked out of Ethel's parlor, reeling from what she had just told him, but clear about what he needed to do. He now realized that he had been completely wrong in his interpretation of the diary. Now he had to learn more about Bobby, a lot more. He immediately dispatched one detective to Rockland State Psychiatric Hospital in upstate New York to pull Bobby's medical records. And when Lyons saw what the records contained, he and his colleagues became increasingly alarmed at the kind of person they were dealing with. Bobby had a history of mental breakdowns and sudden explosions of violence dating back to when he was just 14 years old. Once he tried to amputate his own penis and ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a year and a half. In fact, he had just been released when he had met Ronnie. There was no time to lose. They needed to talk to Bobby right away. So they went straight to the boarding house where he was staying. Bobby wasn't there, but his journal was. In it, he ranted and raved about Mary and Ronnie and how they were the reason his relationship with Ethel had broken up. Meanwhile, other detectives have been going from store to store in the New York City area, trying to find who sold the killer the gray suede glove that was left behind at the crime scene. Eventually, they found a young clerk in a J.J. Newberry's department store who remembered selling the gloves to a man just a few short weeks before. And when this young clerk described the man, it matched the description of Bobby perfectly. Inspector Lyons now realized he had a new primary suspect, someone with a clear motive to harm the Gideons and who had been physically linked to the crime scene. Lyons had Ronnie's father, Joseph Gideon, released on bail from his firearms charges. He knew Joseph was not the killer, and early on Monday morning, April 5th, Lyons called a press conference to say that police now knew who committed the Easter Sunday massacre. And he passed out pictures of this new person to the gathered reporters. Soon, Bobby's face would be on the front page of newspapers all across America. Over the next 3 months, police heard dozens of rumors about where to find Bobby, but none of them panned out until late June, when a hotel employee in Cleveland reported that one of her coworkers looked exactly like Bobby. The man called himself Bob Murray, but she offered that it could be a fake name. Unfortunately, the woman decided to speak to this so-called Bob Murray person about his resemblance to the Bobby police were looking for, and it turned out it was Bobby. This startled him and gave him a warning that his cover was blown, and so Bob Murray jumped on the first Greyhound bus headed for Chicago, leaving the police empty-handed again. The media began to poke fun at the police's inability to catch their murderer, portraying him as this crafty fugitive who was capable of eluding a nationwide manhunt. But it was at this time, totally out of the blue, Bobby decided to just turn himself in. He figured that eventually he was going to get caught, so why not make some money first? He decided to call one of Chicago's big city newspapers, the Chicago Herald-Examiner, and sell his whole sordid story. On the evening of Saturday, June 26th, Bobby sat down with reporters to describe in detail his role in the triple murder 3 months earlier. But it would turn out this Bobby was not Bobby Flower, Ronnie's ex-husband. This was a very different Bobby. When Inspector Lyons had gone to Ethel's house with Ronnie's diary and started asking her about why Bobby Flower had begun stalking her, Ethel had been totally lost. Bobby Flower had been the love of Ethel's sister's life and had remained her friend until her death. But when Inspector Lyons started showing Ethel the actual passages of Ronnie's writing, it clicked for her and she realized Ronnie was talking about a different Bobby in her diary. Not Bobby Flower, but Bobby Irwin, the young sculptor who had once rented a room with the family and subsequently become infatuated with Ethel. And so the police had just confused the two Bobbies. Here's the real story of what happened to Ronnie and Mary Gideon and the boarder that was living with them, Frank Burns. Bobby Irwin was a down-on-his-luck 26-year-old sculptor who the Gideon family had taken on as a boarder in 1934, 3 years before the murders. Ronnie had been 17 at the time and was still recovering from her failed marriage to the other Bobby. Ethel had been 21 years old and was building a career as a secretary after her own marriage had just fizzled out. Both sisters at the time were avoiding romantic entanglements. But Bobby Irwin, who called himself Bob, even though Ronnie referred to him exclusively as Bobby in her diary, was a confident guy. He was sure that one day he would be recognized as one of the world's greatest sculptors, and he thought Ethel was totally beautiful. He had even convinced Ethel to sit for him so that he could create a sculpture of her head out of marble. And the end product, Ethel's whole family agreed, was totally striking. The sculpture version of Ethel was both beautiful and peaceful. Her eyes were closed as if she was sleeping. While Ronnie had always thought Bob Irwin was very creepy, Ethel had actually found him very talented and charismatic at first. He would take her to art museums where he would tell her all about the great masters and how his own artistic technique, something he called visualization, would lead him to the top as well. Ethel enjoyed the outings, but when Irwin asked her to marry him one summer night as they walked on the East River waterfront down by the piers, she was floored. Ethel told Irwin no and said that she was already engaged to an aspiring lawyer. This would be the man that Ethel would later marry. She said she still wanted to be friends with Irwin, but Irwin was totally heartbroken. After that, living in the same house was very uncomfortable, and so Irwin moved out later in 1934. That had been the end of the story as far as Ethel was concerned, but the story was not over for Bobby Irwin. By March 27, 1937, the day of the murders, Bobby Irwin lived at a boarding house a short walk from Ronnie and Mary's place. He still hadn't made it big as an artist. That very day, in fact, he had interviewed for another job that did not pan out. And he blamed the failures of his life on Ethel. He decided he couldn't live with her being married to someone else, so he sharpened his ice pick and set out for the Gideon home. His plan was actually just to kill Ethel, but his plan was flawed. He didn't realize that Ethel did not live there anymore. She had her own place with her husband in Queens. No one was home in the apartment when Irwin arrived, so he waited on the sidewalk until Mary Gideon arrived. Mary was not scared of Bob Irwin at all. Despite his obvious pining for her older daughter, he seemed like a nice guy. So she let him follow her up to the apartment. Mary was tired and not eager to visit, but she was polite as Irwin pulled out his sketchbook and began to draw her. In reality, he was stalling for time in hopes that Ethel would arrive. Then Mary's boarder, Frank Burns, came home and said hello before quickly retiring to his own bedroom. Eventually, Mary got tired of this long visit and just told Irwin that he had to leave. But Irwin said he was not going to leave until he saw Ethel. And so Mary said, okay, well, I'm going to get my boarder to throw you out. And that's when Irwin lunged for Mary's throat, squeezing as tight as he could and holding on even as she scratched his face repeatedly with her fingernails. And he kept choking Mary for 20 minutes until she was completely still. Then he stuffed her body under the bed in one of the smaller bedrooms. Irwin was astonished that Frank did not come out of his room during all the commotion, but he didn't have time to think about the boarder. He was there to kill Ethel. It occurred to Irwin that Ronnie might be the next person to come home, not Ethel, and he didn't want to kill Ronnie. It's true that she had disapproved of his relationship with Ethel, but he didn't hold a grudge about that. So he walked into the bathroom and grabbed a bar of soap and put it inside of a sock. If Ronnie came home first, he decided, he would just smack her in the face with the soap and hopefully knock her out. Erwin waited for nearly 2 hours in the dark of the Gideons' apartment until finally he heard Ronnie's voice after 3 a.m. speaking to her little dog. And when Ronnie finally came into the bedroom where Erwin was waiting, he wound up and smashed her on the left cheek with the bar of soap inside of the sock, shattering the soap into pieces. But to Erwin's surprise, this vicious blow seemed to have no effect on Ronnie. She just stood there. So Erwin grabbed her by the throat and pushed her onto the bed. He would say that he did not want to kill her at this point, but she was just making it so hard. He tried to disguise his voice, hoping she wouldn't recognize him, but she spoke to him by name as he was grappling with her, and she told him he was going to get in trouble if he didn't stop. And this was just too much for Erwin, and so he would furiously choke the life out of Ronnie and then rip off her clothes just to make the attack look as degrading as possible. By then, it was after 5 a.m., Ethel had not come back yet, and so Erwin knew he just needed to leave. But first, he knew he had to get rid of Frank, the boarder. Now, Frank never came out during the 2 attacks on the women, likely because he was almost deaf and didn't hear them. But Erwin thought he just could not take any chances, so he crept into Frank's room and began stabbing Frank in the face with his ice pick again and again and again. Finally, after Frank was dead, Erwin headed for the door, his only regret being that he did not get to kill Ethel. The Chicago Herald and Examiner paid Erwin $5,000 for his confession. It was the most money Erwin had ever made in his life, but the cops arrested him before he could spend it. New York prosecutors said they would be seeking the death penalty, but Erwin would plead guilty on the eve of his trial and would be sentenced to 139 years in prison instead. Bobby Erwin would live in mental hospitals until his death in 1975.
On September 19, 2013, 69-year-old retired middle school teacher Amy Linkert and her friend, 63-year-old Joe Blakesley, who was a physician, headed off to the Craters on the Moon Park in Idaho. This park is actually a dormant volcano. It's not extinct. It's going to be active again, probably in the next 1,000 years. But for now, it's this beautiful park that is known for these crazy lava fields that look otherworldly. Barely any vegetation can grow on them, and there's just a strip of pavement they've kind of weaved through these massive jagged lava fields. And then you have all these big mounds that are the actual volcanoes. Another feature of this park are all the lava tubes underground. All the molten lava, when it jets around underneath the surface before shooting out, it carves these natural tunnels underground, these huge caverns. They're like these big caves you can explore. And there's 1,100 miles of lava tubes, tunnels, and caves underneath this park. The 2 women told their families they would be back in Boise, Idaho by the 21st, but when the 21st came and they were not home, their families were suspicious. They tried calling them, they didn't pick up, and for the next 36 hours, they just kept trying to call them and called around to see if anybody else knew where they were. And then finally, on the morning of the 23rd, when no one knew where they were, they reached out to the authorities. The formal search for these 2 women began on the 24th, so 5 days after they had initially left for this trip, and the searchers quickly found their pickup truck parked in the parking lot of the Craters on the Moon Park. And in their truck were their 2 dogs, who were alive, they were okay, and in the front seat were their purses and their cell phones, but there was no sign of Amy or Joe. This was obviously a bad sign, and so the search was really kicked into high gear to see if they could find these women before it was too late. But unfortunately, within 24 hours of finding the truck, they would find Amy's body. And her body was located way off of the main trail. She was in an area that the park superintendent described as incredibly rugged and inaccessible. Now, at this park, there is a strip of cement that weaves through this really dangerous lava field. And if you were on this strip of cement, you wouldn't be thinking about walking onto the lava field. Not only would you need to navigate all these massive mounds of jagged, cooled lava, there's all these cracks in the ground that you could fall through and just plummet to your death. So no one's about to start walking off the trail, especially not 2 older women that went here just to have a casual stroll through the park. They were not there for some grand adventure. They were not athletic distance hikers. It made no sense that Amy would be so far off the trail in an area that was so dangerous and so clearly off limits. When the families were notified that Amy had been found and they were still looking for Joe, the detail that the family keyed in on was the idea that these two women left their dogs in the truck. That was something so unbelievably uncharacteristic of either of them. They adored those two dogs. They would never, ever abandon them like that. In fact, because of that detail, the families jumped to this has to be foul play because they never would have done that. They wouldn't have abandoned these precious dogs. The search for Joe would continue. They basically shifted the entire effort to center over Amy where she was found and work in circles out from there to see if they could find her. They had helicopters flying overhead. They had mining experts walking through all the lava tubes below, and they couldn't find her. Finally, on October 23rd, so 28 days after Amy was found, Joe's body was discovered as well, and she was lying 1 mile away from where Amy had been found in a similarly inaccessible part of the park that would have required significant climbing over jagged, cooled lava fields and all these cracks in the ground she would have had to navigate to reach where she was. And even more strangely is the area where she was found had been searched extensively by air with helicopter pilots flying overhead and by cadaver sniffing dogs that had been in that area and they had not picked up her scent. So either the helicopter pilots and the cadaver sniffing dogs were just wrong or missed something, or Joe had not been there the whole time. A cause of death has not been determined for either of the two women. However, what was released is neither of them appeared to have suffered an incapacitating injury, meaning they weren't struck down where they were. They were traveling and ultimately stopped where they were. It seems highly unlikely that these two women abandoned their two dogs and left their cell phones in the car and then wandered way off the trail and separated from each other, all without supplies. But even if they had done that, even if they had, separated and left the trail, where they ultimately reached seems like an area they would not have been able to get to without assistance. And since they were separated, they weren't able to help each other get where they were. So although authorities have ruled out foul play, this was deemed an accident, it does seem like if there was ever a place to commit an attack, it would be this particular park, because underneath the park is 1,100 miles of lava tubes that connect to each other and weave all through the park, and there's hundreds of caves, many of which have not been found or explored, that it would be pretty straightforward to attack someone and then go underground and not be found. Certainly makes you wonder who or what could be hiding underground in those lava tubes.
Our next story is called Stay in the Car. Before dawn on December 12, 1992, a 17-year-old girl named Tracy Dion sat in the passenger seat of a little two-door car that was swerving down a deserted road in the Yankton Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. Everybody in the car was drunk, including Tracy. Sitting next to Tracy in the middle front seat was her 19-year-old cousin named Ruby, and Ruby's boyfriend, a 20-year-old named Arnold, was driving the car. All three of them had been out partying all night, and so now they were trying to make it home. The swerving was making Tracy feel sick to her stomach, but she didn't want to say anything to Arnold in fear that she might distract him. It was really dark outside, there was no streetlights, there was ice on the road. For a sober driver, this would be a challenging drive, let alone a drunk driver. They were coming up on an intersection, and Arnold brought the car to a stop with a lurch. Tracy watched as Arnold checked for cross traffic and then pulled out onto Highway 281. But halfway through this turn, as Arnold was accelerating, Tracy began to feel the car slide. And even in her drunken state, she could tell Arnold had hit a patch of black ice. And so as the car began to skid, she wanted to scream. Before she could, the car was already flipping over, and then everything went black. A short time later, Tracy came to. The car was upside down, and Tracy quickly realized she had fallen out of her seat and was now basically resting on the roof of the car, which was now on the ground. From what she could tell, after the car had finished rolling over, it had come to a stop just off the side of the highway, and so they were not in immediate danger from other cars striking them. But she couldn't really see outside because the windows were so badly cracked. Beside her, Tracy could hear her cousin, Ruby, pounding on the driver's side door trying to get it to open, and so Tracy tried to look around Ruby to see Arnold to see if he was okay, but when she did, she saw the driver's seat was empty. Tracy tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The driver's side door was closed, but Arnold was gone. Just then, Tracy heard the sound of the driver's side door opening, and she turned to see her cousin Ruby forcing the door open just a few inches, and then a second later, Ruby was slithering out through that crack to the outside. To Tracy, everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She was too shocked and confused to make any sense of it. But if Ruby was getting out of the car, Tracy felt like she should too. And so Tracy turned and crawled across to the driver's side and was about to make an exit the same way Ruby had when the door slammed shut violently right in Tracy's face. Tracy didn't understand why Ruby would do something like that. Why would she shut the door that aggressively when she knew her cousin was still inside? Tracy tried to open the door again, but she was too weak to do it. She figured her cousin Ruby was okay, but she couldn't see outside because of how cracked the windows were. At this point, Tracy began to feel woozy. She laid her head down on the roof of the car, wondering to herself why Ruby and Arnold had left her behind. Tracy would stay trapped inside of the car, alone, for a few hours, until finally a motorist saw the flipped-over car and called 911. Shortly after that, first responders arrived on the scene, they pulled Tracy out of the car, and shockingly, she actually didn't have really any serious injuries at all. She didn't even need to be hospitalized. But rescuers could not find Ruby or Arnold anywhere. They were gone. And once rescuers had scoured the entire area around the crash site, the sheriff who was in charge of the scene started to wonder if Arnold and Ruby were not just missing. Maybe, he thought, they had fled. Arnold had been driving drunk, and all three of them were underage, and so the sheriff thought maybe Arnold and Ruby were scared to get in trouble. Over the next few days, the police continued to search the surrounding area for Arnold and Ruby, hoping they were not badly injured and that they would just turn up on their own, but they never did. And as the days turned into weeks, hope began to wane for the young couple. Their family and friends kept searching the area along 281 where the car had flipped, looking for any clue as to where these two had gone. But there was nothing. There was no trace of them. It was like Arnold and Ruby had gotten out of the car and just vanished. But in January of 1993, so 3 weeks after the crash, strange and conflicting reports of sightings began to trickle in. First, a woman came forward claiming to have seen Arnold, alive and well, at a New Year's Eve party. Now, the police doubted this claim, but this woman was insistent that she had seen Arnold. And they actually hooked her up to a lie detector test, and she passed the test. And so officials brought in guests from this party who this woman claimed were with Arnold, and they asked them, "Were you with Arnold?" And they said no, but they failed their lie detector tests. Now, of course, this was suspicious, but police really didn't know what to do with this information. Assuming this woman's story was true, that she really did see Arnold, well, according to the details of her story, Arnold did not appear to be in any kind of distress. And even if he was in distress, the police still had no idea where he was, so how could they help him? Other locals came forward, claiming to have spotted Arnold around town as well. But nothing came of those reports either. Neither Arnold nor Ruby turned up. Months went by, and the case went cold. Until March 10th, when a driver was going down Highway 281 and they noticed a strange object in the drainage ditch next to the road. By now, the weather was much warmer than it had been on the day of the crash, so instead of snow and ice inside of this drainage ditch, it was runoff water. And the strange object was floating in it. The driver stopped his car, got out, and walked up to see what this thing was, and as soon as he saw it, he turned, ran back to his car, and called the police. Because what the driver had just found was a dead body. And when the police arrived and searched the area, they found another body not far away. The bodies belonged to Ruby and Arnold. But this discovery did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ruby and Arnold. Instead, it made it much more bizarre. Because first of all, the bodies were found 75 feet away from the original crash site. And the exact spots where the two bodies were found had been searched many, many times on the day of the crash, days after the crash. They were searched by police, they were searched by friends and family of Ruby and Arnold. The idea that this is where the bodies had been the whole time was impossible. They would have been found. And then there was the condition of the bodies. Ruby's body was extremely decomposed, which made sense given the fact that the crash was 3 months earlier. But Arnold's body was barely decomposed at all. And in the pocket of Arnold's jeans, police found a mysterious set of 3 keys. 1 was a vehicle key and 2 were house keys. But none of them opened any vehicle or building that Arnold was known to frequent, and nobody recognized them. Finally, the police found a tuft of hair lying near where the bodies had been found. It was Ruby's hair, but it didn't look like the hair had been there for very long, certainly not 3 months. Instead of being dirty and matted, like you would expect given how long she must have been there, the hair was perfectly clean. The official coroner's report on Ruby and Arnold's deaths were that they died of exposure, and then their bodies were just overlooked by searchers for months. But to a lot of people, including the sheriff who was in charge of the original crash site, this made no sense. Despite the coroner's findings, law enforcement officials believed that Ruby and Arnold's deaths were the result of foul play. Under the foul play theory, somebody pulled Ruby and Arnold out of the crash site while they were still alive and then killed them later. And then perhaps they killed them at different times, which would account for the differences in decomposition of their bodies. The FBI ultimately came in and took over this case, but they eventually closed it down, citing a lack of evidence to support the foul play theory. However, with or without foul play being involved here, nobody has a good explanation for all those sightings of Arnold after the crash. And also, nobody can explain why the door was slammed in Tracy's face in the immediate aftermath of the crash. Maybe it was Ruby or Arnold who slammed the door, or maybe it was their killer. To this day, what actually happened on December 12, 1992, on the side of Highway 281 remains a mystery. The third and final story of today's episode is called What Just Happened.
Growing up, Colton Louder was a joy to be around. He was always goofing off and making people smile, and he had a really infectious laugh. But secretly, he was depressed and began self-medicating at a very young age. By the time he was 18, he was a full-fledged drug addict, and by the time he was 25, he was in jail on a life sentence for murdering his uncle over a drug-related dispute. Colton's actions had a profound impact on his family, but none more so than on his twin sister, Kaylin. She had known about his pain even when he was putting on that facade of being happy and bubbly and outgoing, and she had reached out to him and tried to help him, but she could never get through to him, and when he was ultimately convicted, it was crushing to her. She felt like she couldn't help someone who was really vulnerable. But instead of just feeling bad about this, she took her sadness about her brother and watching him spiral and turned that into a laser focus on helping other vulnerable people that were struggling with addiction and depression to try to help them before they end up like her brother. And eventually she would get her degree in social work from Utah State. But despite Kaylin's best intentions to want to help as many people as she could, she found it very difficult to find work in her field, and it wasn't uncommon for her to have fairly long stretches of unemployment. And it was during one of those long stretches in 2014 that Kaylin's life rapidly fell apart, and it left everybody who knew her thinking, what just happened? On September 26, 2014, a little after 9 p.m., Kaylin calls 911. She reported that there was this huge, brutal fight taking place in her condo's clubhouse. Basically, it was like a restaurant where you could rent it out in the first floor of this condo complex. And she said it was getting out of hand and police needed to come over here and stop it before someone got hurt. The police asked her if weapons were involved. Were people using weapons in this fight? And Kaylin says, yes, guns. But when police rush to the scene, bracing for the worst, they discover that it's just a docile wedding reception happening inside of this clubhouse, and not one person in there reported any altercation happening. They were like, we're being pretty quiet. I don't know where she would have got that from. One guest would tell police that they had lit off a single firecracker, but they showed them what they had used, and they were these little tiny cheap things that made almost no noise. So it is possible that Kaylin could have mistaken that for a gunshot, but it does seem highly unlikely. Police leave, and then 1 hour later, Kaylin calls 911 again, but she immediately hangs up as soon as an operator has actually answered the phone. And the operator calls the number back, and Kaylin picks the phone up, but she's not really speaking. She's mumbling, she sounds confused, and the operator said, hey, you tried to call 911 a minute ago. Is everything okay? Can you tell me where you are? And Kaylin would have a really hard time giving her address to the police. It was like she couldn't remember her address. And she's mumbling, and at some point she says, my roommate thinks I'm delusional and paranoid, but I'm not. Kaylin eventually kind of calmed down and said she was sorry for calling 911, and the operator said okay, and they hung up, and that was the end of the call. The next morning, Kaylin calls 911 for a third time in 24 hours. This time, she's frantic. While she's on the phone with the operator, she's periodically screaming at these two people that are apparently robbing her apartment to get the F out of here, get out of my apartment, you can't be here. And the operator is trying to get more information out of Kaylin, but Kaylin is very distressed. She can barely communicate with the operator. She's half crying, and the operator tells her, can you leave? Can you go somewhere safe? And Kaylin says, no, there's only one way out. This is a small apartment. I can't go past them. And the operator tells them that police are on their way. Just stay in your bedroom. Don't go anywhere. And so while Kaylin is huddled in her bedroom and the dispatcher is still on the line listening, you hear Kaylin's roommate, Carol, walk into her bedroom and very calmly say, Kaylin, what's going on? And Kaylin's like, Carol, get over here. You gotta lock the door. Get in here. There's two people in here. They're robbing us. They're out there. They're in the other room. And Carol's like, no, there's no one here. The front door's locked. Kaylin suddenly sounds really confused, and she says, well, I can't explain that, but they must have been in here because I heard them. They must have had a key, and that's how they got in, and that's how they got out. And right at that moment, the responding officers show up, and there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing had been taken. It really looked like nothing had happened, unless someone really did have a key. At this point, Kaylin was very embarrassed. She apologized to the officers, she apologized to her roommate, and she ended up calling her mom and saying, I'm mortified. I can't believe I just called 911 3 different times and nothing came of any of these calls. Like, I feel so embarrassed about it. And her mom, being a good mom, told her, don't worry about it. No one got hurt in the process, so it's all good. And so Kaylin moves past it, and on the call with her mom, she starts talking about what she's going to do that day. She says, well, I'm looking to update my resume and submit it to a couple different job openings, and I also want to clean up my apartment. And so they hang up the phone, and everything seems normal again. But at about 5:45 p.m. that night, Kaylin, along with her beloved little dog named Phyllis that apparently she took everywhere with her, were seen exiting the condo and walking out to the parking lot behind their building. Kaylin was barefoot, was only wearing a tank top and shorts, despite the fact that it was cold and raining. And as soon as she puts her dog down, because she was holding her dog in her arm, Kaylin begins having this totally animated discussion, except there's no one there for her to be talking to. About 15 minutes later, she and her dog turn around and walk back towards the condo complex out of view of a camera, but residents would say they saw her crying and going up to a gate that lets you back into the condo, and she apparently couldn't open it. And as she's standing there struggling, she suddenly stops, puts her dog down, turns, and starts running away. And the camera footage we have of her is only when she's back in the parking lot, but she's running away still, and the dog is nowhere to be found. Her beloved dog she's abandoned, she's got no phone, no wallet, and nobody knows where she's going. Later that night, when Kaylin's family could not get in touch with her, because of all the weirdness around those 911 calls, her family just had a bad feeling about it, and so they filed an official missing person report that night. When police arrived at the condo complex, the first thing they did is they reviewed the security footage. And they already knew about her 3 911 calls that had happened within 24 hours, and all of them had been for unfounded reasons. And they see Kaylin on camera, barefoot in a tank top and shorts in the rain, and she's having this animated discussion with nobody before running around and running away. And so police go to Kaylin's family and they say, does your daughter have a drug problem? Is she mentally ill? And her family tells the police, no, she's got no history of mental illness. She definitely does not have a drug addiction because of what happened to her brother. And they explain what happened with Colton and how that had a tremendous impact on her, and how that had actually sent her on a course to help people with mental illness or people who are fighting against addiction or depression. And they explained how she was just really well adjusted and everything seemed okay until these 911 calls started, and now this. So this huge search is launched between the police and volunteers, and actually the Louder family even hired some private investigators to help them look for Kaylin. But days turned into weeks and there was no leads, no one knew where she was. She had just vanished. Then on December 1st, 10 weeks after she went missing, city workers were inspecting drainage pipes down near the Jordan River, which was a river that went by her apartment, and they discovered behind some plants a body that was half submerged, and it would turn out to be Kaylin's. They pull her out of the water, and no cause of death could be accurately determined because of how long she had been in the water for. It looked like she had been in there for probably all of the 10 weeks she had been missing. They were able to determine that there were no drugs in her system and there was no water in her lungs, which meant she didn't drown. Her body was found 5 miles from where her apartment was, and so initial speculation was she must have gotten hurt and fallen into this river and drifted the 5 miles downstream to where she was found. But they looked at that section of the river between her apartment and where she was found, and the water was simply too shallow and windy, and it would not have been possible for a human body to travel that distance. Which means almost immediately after she ran off screen on the security footage, she covered those 5 miles, wound up at that section of the Jordan River, died, and then fell in the water, or fell in the water and then died, but not via drowning. The police officially ruled Kaylin's death an accident, but her family disagrees. They say if you look really closely at the security footage right before she runs away, it looks like she's terrified. More specifically, it looks like she's terrified of someone we can't see on camera. When she's having that animated discussion where it looks like she's talking to no one, further feeding the idea that she had kind of lost it, well, there's this huge rock to the right in the video that kind of obscures our view, and behind that is this huge forest. And it is theoretically possible that someone could be back there that we can't see. But no matter what, her family believes that whatever she was doing in her final moments on camera is the key to understanding why she ran off and ultimately died. So you be the judge. Was this a psychotic break, or is there something more?
To grow up, to make my own choices every day. I thought adults always knew the answers, like they had a map that showed the way. Then one day I packed my bags and left. It's when I learned nobody has it all. That's when I learned nobody has it all. We're all still figuring things out as we go. Some lessons aren't written in textbooks. Time teaches them through experience. Every step becomes a line in the story of a journey called growing up. This is the cost of growing up. Pay with effort every single day. With every morning filled with purpose and the courage to keep moving on our way. This is the cost of growing up. It is
Te vi llegar, mar de sal, con tus ojos de azar. Yo llevaba el corazón hecho polvo en tu portal. Tu falda dijo que sí, sin mover ni una señal. Y mi pecho al verte así se quedó sin respirar. Ay, me tienes temblando por dentro y por fuera. Si te vas me quedo sin luna en la arena. Sangre y sal, tú me vuelves a llamar. Sangre y sal, sangre.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.